a superstar earning millions of dollars, standing on par with the greatest monuments of the silent film era. But when the legend passed away, the man was merely a nameless elder, exhausted by leukemia, forgotten in a remote countryside. Without decadence, without scandals, this king of the West was dethroned for a cruel, ironic reason: the advent of sound. Into what desperate efforts did Jack Hoxie drain his staggering fortune, only to die in extreme poverty? The devastating silence of a rural hospital room holds the final, bitter answer. It is the year 1965. We are deep inside the vast, unforgiving plains of the Oklahoma Panhandle. The vibrant, golden sunshine of Southern California feels like an entirely different planet. Inside a sterile, poorly lit medical facility, an elderly man lies motionless on a cheap mattress. There are no flashing press cameras gathered outside his wooden door. There are no frantic studio directors yelling action through a megaphone. There is no roaring crowd of adoring fans waiting desperately for a signature. The only sound filling this depressing space is the steady, agonizing rhythm of his own failing breath. His physical condition is devastating to witness. A vicious, aggressive case of leukemia is systematically destroying his bloodstream from the inside out. This specific biological enemy cannot be fought with a prop silver revolver or a cinematic horseback chase. Blood cancer operates as a methodical, cold-blooded killer. The disease systematically strips away every ounce of human dignity and raw physical strength. Look closely at the gaunt, deeply lined face resting against the thin cotton hospital pillow. This frail, broken body previously belonged to a towering, invincible action hero. The gladiator used to effortlessly perform dangerous acrobatic stunts that left entire theater audiences breathless. The icon used to physically dominate the glowing silver screen with unmatched, raw, masculine energy. Now, simply lifting his head off the pillow to drink a small glass of water requires a profound, exhausting physical effort. The powerful Hollywood studio system abandoned the actor several decades ago. The outcast is permanently trapped in the harsh, isolated reality of rural America. This represents the brutal, unforgiving isolation that eventually claims so many forgotten historical figures. When the capitalist entertainment machine finally finishes consuming your youth, the system spits you out directly into the freezing dark. The veteran is dying entirely alone, thousands of miles away from the glittering, sprawling mansions he once proudly owned. Dying of a terminal illness stands as a universally terrifying human experience. But dying of a terminal illness in crushing poverty elevates that specific terror to a profound psychological level. The relentless medical bills stacked up month after month. The invoices buried whatever meager, pathetic financial resources the patient still had left to his name. The financial devastation proved absolute, permanent, and irreversible. We are not talking about a temporary economic setback or a minor dip in a wealthy investment portfolio. We are talking about total, catastrophic, inescapable financial ruin. This is a man who previously generated unprecedented fortunes for the executives at Universal Pictures. The star previously possessed a personal bank account that rivaled the biggest, most powerful titans of early 20th century capitalism. The idol lived a life of luxury in sprawling, custom-built estates. Yet, as the aggressive leukemia finally consumed his last remaining days, his pockets were utterly empty. There was no secret Hollywood trust fund waiting in the shadows to cover mounting hospital expenses. There was no hidden vault of gold coins buried in the Oklahoma dirt. Every single dime of his world-famous Hollywood fortune was gone. The businessman had already bled an entire empire dry through a series of desperate, catastrophic financial gambles. The humiliation of going from a millionaire superstar to a man who could barely afford basic survival necessities acts as a psychological torture very few people can ever comprehend. The ruthless entertainment industry turns its back on this kind of failure. His wealthy, powerful former colleagues did not send expensive custom floral arrangements to the hospital room. The executives did not offer a dramatic, last-minute financial rescue package. Former friends simply pretended the actor no longer existed on the face of the earth. The terrifying, cold reality of his situation set in, as the blood cancer rapidly spread through frail bones. The man who once generated millions of dollars literally possessed only enough loose change to afford the cheapest wooden coffin available on the market. It represents a staggering, violently depressing, economic contrast. When the aggressive leukemia finally claimed his life, the immediate aftermath felt brutally, deafeningly quiet. There was no heavily attended state funeral. There was no publicized, televised memorial service attended by weeping Hollywood royalty. His passing was handled with the quick, pragmatic, emotionless efficiency reserved for the deeply impoverished. His remains were quietly and swiftly transported to the Willow Bar Cemetery. This stands as a small, unremarkable, dusty graveyard tucked away in the forgotten landscape of Oklahoma. It is a rural place, untouched by the artificial glowing glamour of the Los Angeles entertainment industry. The burial service was stripped of any theatrical pageantry or grand emotional speeches. A man who once commanded the undivided attention of the entire world was lowered into the cold, unforgiving earth with zero fanfare. Standing over his modest dirt plot provides a chilling, permanent historical reminder of the sheer cruelty of public memory. Carved directly into his simple, inexpensive resting place is a specific, deeply emotional epitaph. The weathered stone reads exactly like this: a star in life, a star in heaven. Reading those heavily engraved words creates an intense wave of profound sadness. It is a heartbreaking, painfully desperate attempt to validate a shattered, forgotten legacy. The harsh, undeniable reality reveals that the man resting beneath that dirt was aggressively discarded by the very industry that originally created him. The epitaph desperately tries to remind the passing world of his former glory, but the quiet, isolated rural cemetery tells the actual, devastating historical truth. The world had already moved on completely. The ornate cinema houses were now playing brand new talking pictures featuring younger faces. The silent film icon was permanently buried. The legend was broke, entirely forgotten, and left to quietly decay under the harsh Oklahoma sun. Measuring the sheer magnitude of that tragic Oklahoma grave requires looking back at the astronomical height of the mountain the icon actually fell from. The depressing reality of his final impoverished days masks a historical empire, built entirely on silver screen glory. The 1920s represented an explosive, unprecedented era of raw cinematic wealth. Hollywood was rapidly transforming from a dusty collection of orange groves into a lucrative global entertainment monopoly. During this frantic gold rush, the silent film industry desperately needed authentic, commanding figures to anchor their theatrical releases. The American public was fiercely obsessed with the romantic mythology of the wild western frontier. However, audiences were becoming incredibly skilled at spotting cheap artificial imitations on the movie screens. Crowds did not want to watch trained theater actors awkwardly riding gentle studio ponies in clean, tailored costumes. They demanded genuine grit, raw athletic danger, and undeniable authenticity. This intense cultural demand perfectly set the global stage for a legitimate working man to conquer the industry. Long before the heavy theatrical makeup and the blinding studio lights, he was a genuine, hard-working cowpuncher operating in the rugged plains of Idaho. He did not learn how to handle a temperamental horse or throw a heavy lasso by attending an expensive acting academy. The cowboy learned those dangerous skills by surviving the brutal, physically exhausting reality of actual ranch work. His calloused hands, natural commanding posture in the leather saddle, and deep understanding of the frontier lifestyle were entirely authentic. When the Rough Rider finally stepped in front of a primitive rolling camera for the popular serial Lightning Bryce in 1919, the impact was immediate and explosive. Theater audiences instantly recognized that the imposing man on the screen was not faking a rugged persona. The actor brought a terrifyingly real, visceral energy to the choreographed action sequences. He rode faster, hit harder, and looked significantly more dangerous than any of his polished studio competitors. This breakout performance cemented the legendary moniker Jack Hoxie into the permanent consciousness of the American public. The talent quickly transformed from an unknown working cowboy into a bankable cinematic attraction. The Roaring Twenties were rapidly accelerating, and major Hollywood film studios aggressively hunted for exclusive talent to dominate the lucrative Western market. Universal Pictures recognized a flawless money-making machine sitting right in front of them. In 1923, studio executives handed the rising star an exclusive, incredibly lucrative long-term contract. This specific legal document fundamentally changed an entire trajectory, instantly elevating the actor to the highest ranks of Hollywood royalty. The performer was no longer just a popular actor. The man was heavily commodified as a premium global brand. Universal invested vast promotional budgets into carefully crafting an invincible public image. Every legendary cowboy requires an equally legendary cinematic companion to share the heavy burden of fame. The studio wisely paired the leading man with a magnificent, highly intelligent white stallion, famously named Scout. The stark visual contrast of the rugged, dark-haired leading man riding atop a brilliantly white, powerful horse created pure, undeniable cinematic magic. The pair operated together as a flawless, synchronized action unit, performing dangerous stunts that left theater crowds screaming in terror and delight. This powerful dynamic duo dominated the global box office receipts week after week. Their undeniable appeal was showcased in the successful feature film The White Outlaw. In this specific cinematic triumph, the cowboy was strategically paired alongside the glamorous, sought-after actress Marceline Day. The film offered a perfectly engineered mixture of brutal, high-octane Western action and elegant, refined Hollywood romance. The sheer visual magnetism of Hoxie and Day sharing the silent screen generated unprecedented lines outside theaters across the entire country. The leading man possessed the unique, rare ability to seamlessly transition from violently fighting armed outlaws to politely charming sophisticated leading ladies. This versatile charisma turned the actor into the undisputed king of the Universal Pictures Western division. Studio executives literally could not print the theatrical tickets fast enough to satisfy the rabid public demand. However, the zenith of this global power arrived exactly in 1926. Universal Pictures decided to cast their star in a sprawling historical epic titled The Last Frontier. This was not a standard, cheap, easily produced weekend action picture. This was a prestigious cinematic event requiring thousands of background extras, incredibly elaborate historical costumes, and sprawling set designs. In this monumental production, the icon was officially tasked with portraying the legendary historical figure Buffalo Bill Cody. Stepping directly into the heavy leather boots of such an untouchable American icon carries a terrifying amount of professional risk. If a popular actor fails to capture the true historical essence of a national hero, the public backlash is usually swift and merciless. Hoxie did not fail the theatrical assignment. The veteran embodied the towering, confident spirit of Buffalo Bill, delivering a profoundly commanding performance that captivated the nation. The Last Frontier was an explosive box office phenomenon, shattering previous financial records for the studio. The overwhelming success of this specific film officially transformed the cowboy from a successful actor into an untouchable cultural deity. The sheer volume of pure, untaxed wealth flowing directly into personal bank accounts during this era is almost entirely incomprehensible by modern financial standards. The idol was single-handedly generating millions upon millions of dollars, operating as a one-man industrial economy. Universal Pictures' paychecks funded a lifestyle of staggering luxury. The millionaire permanently left the dirty, dusty ranch life of Idaho far behind, trading it for sprawling, incredibly expensive Southern California estates. We are talking about heavily guarded mansions featuring immaculate manicured lawns, sprawling custom-built equestrian stables, and expensive imported European automobiles. The celebrity surrounded himself with the finest tailored clothing, customized silver-studded saddles, and exclusive elite social circles. The superstar lived the exact kind of extravagant, insulated life that most ordinary American citizens could only desperately dream about while sitting in dark movie theaters. Thousands of emotional fan letters poured directly into the universal mailrooms every single morning. The hero was passionately adored by young children who wanted to ride beside him, and deeply admired by adults who craved his rugged confidence. Walking down any major metropolitan street in the country without being mobbed by thousands of hysterical fans was impossible. The pioneer held the powerful American entertainment industry firmly in the calloused palm of a hand. The veteran possessed absolute financial security, a fiercely loyal global fan base, and the explicit backing of a major film studio. Looking at the sheer, towering magnitude of his 1920s empire makes the devastating tragedy of his final days profoundly heartbreaking. The cowboy had successfully conquered the world, mastering the lucrative silent film industry. The icon possessed enough wealth to secure 10 lifetimes of absolute comfort and luxury. The legend stood directly at the highest glittering peak of the Hollywood mountain, surrounded by endless roaring applause and blinding flashes of success. Nobody watching the hero ride proudly across that silver screen could have possibly predicted the terrifying financial ruin waiting quietly, just over the horizon. Hollywood in the late 1920s was a brutal bloodbath. The transition to sound was not a gentle technological upgrade for the film industry. The shift served as a sudden, violent mass extinction event. A single piece of equipment arrived on the dusty backlots and destroyed thousands of careers overnight. Heavy, primitive microphones were dragged onto the sets, and the entire rulebook was thrown in the trash. The era of the silent western was officially dead. Audiences sitting in the dark theaters suddenly demanded something entirely new. Crowds did not just want to see a cowboy draw his gun anymore. Viewers wanted to hear the sharp click of the hammer. Listeners wanted to hear the horse hooves hitting the dirt. Most importantly, the public desperately wanted to hear the rugged voice of their favorite hero. That specific demand created a suffocating atmosphere of pure panic across every major studio lot in California. For the established action stars, the pressure felt paralyzing. Physical stunts, good looks, and trick writing were no longer enough to secure a movie ticket. You had to speak clearly, hit your marks, and deliver genuine emotion through a microphone. This sudden shift exposed the deeply guarded, fatal weakness of Jack Hoxie. The undisputed king of the Universal Pictures Western Division had a crippling secret. Behind the expensive leather boots and the arrogant swagger, Hoxie was hiding a profound vulnerability from the public. His formal education was practically non-existent. The actor was a real cowboy who spent his youth surviving on harsh ranches in Idaho, The young worker learned how to break wild horses and throw a lasso, but never spent any real time inside a classroom. Jack Hoxie was functionally illiterate. During the golden age of silent films, this severe academic limitation was incredibly easy to hide. The production sets were chaotic and loud. A silent film director would just stand right next to the camera with a megaphone. The filmmaker would literally shout instructions at the actors while the film was rolling. Foreman would yell at Hoxie to look angry, ride faster, or punch the villain. Hoxie never had to read a single word of a printed script. The action star simply reacted to the shouting in real time. But the arrival of the sensitive boom microphone obliterated that safety net. The set now had to be silent. The director could no longer speak during a take. Suddenly, young studio assistants were walking up to the biggest star in the world and handing him thick, typewritten scripts. To a man who cannot read, a script is not just a stack of paper. The document is a terrifying, unsolvable puzzle. The psychological terror of holding those pages while the entire crew waited on him was absolute torture. The leading man would stand under the scorching hot studio lights, sweating profusely, staring at letters that made no sense to him. The commanding, invincible physical presence he usually projected evaporated. When someone finally read the lines out loud for him to memorize, the actual delivery proved a complete disaster. The voice coming out of the rugged hero felt incredibly stiff and painfully awkward. The cowboy lacked any sort of refined theatrical vocal training. The veteran sounded like a nervous amateur desperately trying to remember lines, rather than a confident frontier hero. The cinematic illusion was instantly shattered the second the actor opened his mouth. The Hollywood studio machine operates without a single ounce of empathy. Executives at Universal Pictures sat in private screening rooms and listened to terrible audio tests. Bosses looked at the rapidly shifting box office metrics across the country. The investors knew exactly what was happening to their industry. Corporate leaders realized instantly that their million-dollar asset was dying right in front of them. A silent action star who cannot effectively deliver dialogue is a severe financial liability in the era of the talkies. The studio did what it always does when a product stops working. Producers called the actor into the executive boardroom. The year was 1927. Hoxie walked into a room full of suits, expecting the usual star treatment. Instead, executives slid a brand-new, insulting contract directly across the mahogany table. Universal wanted to drastically slash his astronomical salary. The studio wanted to strip away top billing and demote the legend to minor, low-budget secondary features. The executives looked at the functionally illiterate actor and expected the star to quietly surrender. Management figured the veteran had no other options in the new sound era, but the corporation underestimated the sheer, blinding size of his artistic pride. A man who had spent the last decade being worshipped as a literal god does not simply accept a public execution. A massive ego simply could not psychologically process the idea of stepping backward. The idol looked at the executives, refused to negotiate the terms, and pushed the contract away. Hoxie stubbornly believed that his global fan base was far bigger than the new technology. The arrogant star assumed the crowds would follow him anywhere, regardless of what Universal Pictures decided to do. The legend stood up from the table, turned a back on the studio, and walked right out the door. It was the most catastrophic, self-destructive decision of his entire life. By letting wounded pride dictate a business strategy, the pioneer actively triggered a permanent downfall. The actor walked away from the only corporate machine that could have possibly protected him. The fugitive walked straight out of the studio gates and directly into the abyss. The sheer blinding arrogance of a dethroned Hollywood god rarely allows a star to recognize when an era has died. Walking away from Universal Pictures was not a calculated, strategic retreat. The exit served as an emotional temper tantrum fueled by fragile vanity. The veteran genuinely believed his global fame acted as an impenetrable shield against changing times. The outcast assumed he could bypass the modernized film industry and force the public to love a silent hero again on his own terms. The idol decided to resurrect a fading image by returning to the oldest, rawest form of American entertainment. The year is 1937. The entire country is suffocating under the crushing economic weight of the Great Depression. Millions of regular citizens are standing in endless bread lines, struggling desperately just to survive another week. Ordinary families do not have spare coins to waste on traveling carnivals. Ignoring every blaring economic warning sign, the former action star makes the most catastrophic gamble of a lifetime. The veteran decides to take his brand directly to the dusty roads of the rural heartland. The entrepreneur liquidates remaining valuable assets to fund this reckless dream. The seller auctions off the sprawling California estates, the imported luxury cars, and the custom silver saddles. The gambler drains bank accounts until nothing remains but dust. The founder takes that final pile of wealth and pours it directly into creating the Hoxie circus. The showman is convinced that a famous name printed in bold red letters across giant canvas tents will conjure roaring crowds out of thin air. The pioneer wants to recapture the thrilling, visceral energy of live performance, far away from the tyranny of typewritten scripts and boom microphones. But running a traveling circus during a severe national economic depression is a logistical nightmare. The venture requires an astronomical amount of daily operating cash just to keep the lights on. Management must feed hundreds of exotic animals, pay wages to specialized acrobats, and maintain a small army of manual laborers known as roostaboats. Owners must transport heavy rigging, wooden bleachers, and massive animals across thousands of miles of unpaved roads. A traveling circus acts as a ravenous beast that eats money before the sun even rises. The daily overhead costs are staggering. Buying tons of fresh meat for the lions and endless bales of hay for the trick horses requires a continuous cash flow. The ringmaster severely miscalculates the actual depth of his remaining public appeal. The aging star still pictures himself as the untouchable king of the western frontier. The brutal reality dictates that the American public has already forgotten the silent era. Audiences are sitting safely inside comfortable, air-conditioned movie theaters. Patrons are captivated by polished talking pictures featuring dynamic, youthful action stars. Viewers have zero interest in standing outside in a humid, muddy field to watch an aging silent film actor perform outdated rope tricks. The anticipated crowds never materialize. The grand, heavily promoted opening nights are met with rows of empty wooden bleachers. The fading idol rides a magnificent horse into the center ring, expecting a deafening roar. Instead, the performer hears only scattered, polite clapping from a handful of locals. The financial bleeding starts immediately. The crisis rapidly accelerates into an uncontrollable hemorrhage. The daily expenses violently collide with pathetic, practically non-existent ticket sales. Rainstorms wash out entire weekends, meaning zero revenue comes in, but the animals still need to eat and the crew still demands their weekly pay. A man who is functionally illiterate and possesses zero formal business training is suddenly trying to manage a complex traveling enterprise. When circus accountants hand the owner the weekly ledgers, the boss cannot comprehend the devastating numbers written on the page. The executive cannot read the complicated fine print on vendor contracts or the municipal permits required to set up the tents. The founder navigates a fiscal minefield blindfolded. The desperate businessman signs predatory loans with exorbitant interest rates just to keep the show moving to the next town. The entire structural foundation of the operation begins collapsing within mere weeks. performers sense the impending doom. Paychecks start bouncing. The morale of the crew plummets as food rations shrink. The owner desperately injects his own remaining personal funds to keep the tents upright. The gambler sells personal jewelry and pawns remaining Hollywood keepsakes just to buy diesel fuel for the transport trucks. The former star is frantically trying to keep the beautiful artificial illusion alive. It represents a toxic combination of wounded pride and financial delusion. The ringmaster refuses to accept defeat, pumping last remaining dollars into a sinking ship. But the inevitable collapse happens with terrifying speed. The Jack Hoxie circus officially goes bankrupt during its very first operating season. The enterprise does not even survive a single year on the road. The failure is not a slow, graceful decline. The crash strikes as a violent, immediate execution. Aggressive creditors swarm the failing operation like starving vultures. Debt collectors do not care about past cinematic glory or a wounded ego. Bankers only care about reclaiming their lost capital. Foreclosure teams arrive at the fairgrounds with local sheriffs and thick stacks of legal notices. The scene is chaotic and deeply tragic. Authorities ruthlessly seize everything the founder owns to satisfy the mounting debts. Police repossess the customized sleeping wagons and the intricate staging equipment. Officials confiscate the canvas tents, pulling the fabric down into the mud while the townspeople watch. Deputies chain up the transport trucks and padlock the ticket booths. Worst of all, bailiffs even seize the very horses the cowboy trained and rode. The inescapable humiliation feels profound and public. The man who once generated millions of dollars for a Hollywood studio is stripped bare in a dusty, forgotten field. The former idol stands alone, watching strangers hitch his assets to their trucks and drive away. The millionaire cowboy is reduced to a penniless spectator at his own funeral. The arrogant gamble failed in the most spectacular way possible. The veteran plummets directly from the peak of Hollywood royalty straight into the darkest depths of poverty. The circus disaster permanently erases his staggering wealth. The collapse officially cements a tragic exile from the entertainment industry. The debtor has nothing left to sell, nowhere left to run, and no money to buy a ticket home. The sprawling empire built over a decade of silver screen dominance is wiped out in a matter of months by his own stubborn hand. Surviving a catastrophic financial wipeout usually forces a man to entirely reconsider a fundamental approach to reality. The massive traveling entertainment debacle stripped away a highly inflated artistic ego. The veteran was no longer desperately trying to be a towering cinematic deity worshipped by millions of fans. The father simply wanted to survive the brutal economic climate of the era. The husband needed a practical, reliable method to put basic food on the table for his family. The glamorous illusions of Southern California were dead and buried in the past. The survivor gathered the last remaining fragments of shattered personal wealth. Scraping together every hidden penny, the fallen star formed a tight partnership with a fiercely devoted third wife, Dixie Starr. The couple looked entirely away from the toxic, artificial glare of Hollywood and headed deep into the rugged, unforgiving desert landscape of Arizona. The partners made a calculated decision to leverage the only genuine, authentic skill the cowboy actually possessed. The founders officially opened a sprawling tourist destination named the Broken Arrow Ranch. It served as a desperate attempt to build a quiet life away from the cameras. This specific venture was not a glamorous cinematic production or a flashy theatrical tour. The operation was a traditional working dude ranch explicitly designed to cater to wealthy Eastern tourists. Affluent citizens from crowded cities would gladly pay good money to travel out west and experience a sanitized version of the frontier lifestyle. Guests could ride gentle, well-trained horses, eat hearty cowboy meals around a roaring campfire, and listen to authentic stories from a former silver screen icon. It provided an honest, respectable way to monetize a fading legacy without facing studio executives. The retreat functioned as a practical, surprisingly grounded business strategy for a fallen star. The ranch allowed the veteran to directly capitalize on a famous Western persona without the suffocating pressure of typewritten scripts or angry Hollywood directors. For a brief, fleeting moment in time, it genuinely looked like this desperate final gamble might work. The Arizona sun burned harsh, but the steady, reliable flow of paying guests provided a desperately needed financial lifeline. The father was slowly, agonizingly dragging his family out of the deep abyss of total bankruptcy. The survivor was finally breathing clean air again. However, the sprawling American wilderness remains a highly unpredictable, ruthless environment. Nature possesses zero respect for human ambition, past Hollywood glory, or desperate financial struggles. The harsh desert ecosystem does not care if you were once a world-famous actor or just another struggling local businessman. The environment operates entirely on brutal, unforgiving natural laws. A thriving commercial business built of dry wood, sitting directly in the arid, scorching Arizona heat, always walks an invisible tightrope. The margin for error in the isolated rural desert is practically non-existent for any small business owner. Total disaster did not arrive in the familiar form of a greedy studio executive or a predatory bank foreclosure. Doom arrived as a violent, uncontrollable force of raw, unbridled nature. Deep in the middle of a quiet, unassuming night, a terrifying inferno suddenly erupted across the Broken Arrow Ranch. The dry, arid desert winds instantly caught the initial stray sparks, transforming the embers into a roaring wall of pure, fiery destruction. The towering flames moved with blinding, catastrophic speed across the property, consuming everything in their path with terrifying prejudice. There was no time to organize a proper bucket line or wait for a rural volunteer fire department to arrive. The wooden guest cabins, the expansive main lodges, and the intricate equestrian stables ignited exactly like dry matchsticks. The intense, blistering physical heat melted the glass windows and violently consumed the heavy structural beams within a matter of minutes. The deafening roar of the massive fire drowned out the frantic, desperate shouts of the ranch hands trying to save the terrified livestock. The entire business was erased before their very eyes. Hoxie and Dixie Star were violently thrown from their comfortable beds, forced to flee blindly into the dark, freezing desert night with literally only the thin clothes on their backs. The couple stood completely helpless in the cold air, physically trembling as they watched the towering orange flames aggressively devour their entire future. Every single drop of exhausted sweat, every single borrowed dollar, and every single ounce of their remaining hope was systematically reduced to black, smoking ash. The fire showed no mercy, burning the entire commercial compound straight down to the bare, rocky Arizona dirt. The owners were forced to witness the destruction of their final sanctuary in real time. When the harsh, unforgiving morning sun finally rose over the devastated landscape, the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe felt paralyzing. The Broken Arrow Ranch was gone, erased from the earth as if it never existed. There was nothing of value left to physically salvage from the smoking, charred, blackened ruins. In the brutal landscape of early 20th century American business, a catastrophic physical event like this, without comprehensive corporate insurance coverage, means instantaneous, permanent financial death. There is no magical safety net waiting to catch you when nature takes everything away. The pioneer did not just lose a physical wooden building or a temporary stream of income. The entrepreneur lost an absolute final, desperate chance at basic financial redemption. The Dude Ranch venture served as the last live bullet in his economic revolver. The gambler had already foolishly drained a staggering Hollywood fortune, and now raw nature had aggressively stolen his final, humble backup plan. The victim was an aging, functionally illiterate former actor, standing quietly in the middle of a burned-out desert with zero operating capital. The finality of the situation remained entirely inescapable and devastatingly complete. The crushing, suffocating weight of total poverty slammed into the old cowboy with the unstoppable force of a speeding freight train. There were no hidden bank accounts left anywhere in the country to tap into. There were no wealthy, sympathetic investors waiting in the wings to hand the veteran another business loan. The universe had violently slammed the final heavy iron door on a professional life. The fallen star was completely, utterly, and permanently wiped out, left to face the terrifying prospect of old age with empty pockets and broken dreams. The Arizona ashes had barely cooled before the brutal reality of basic human hunger forced the outcast back onto the unforgiving road. There was no comfortable safety net waiting to catch a heavily defeated former actor. The meager Social Security checks of the era were insufficient to sustain a man who had watched a final business venture burn to the ground. The veteran was entirely stripped of his pride, his property, and his fading youth. The survivor was forced to physically drag an aging, broken body back into the only environment that would still vaguely recognize his face. The fallen idol began a humiliating, agonizing descent into the lowest possible tiers of the American entertainment machine. The veteran started actively begging for degrading performance slots at cheap provincial county fairs and rundown traveling carnivals. Picture a man who used to command multi-million-dollar Hollywood sets now quietly standing outside a rusted wire fence. His shoulders heavily hunched, permanently weighed down by decades of financial failures and immense personal regret. The actor is wearing faded, patched cowboy clothing that looks more like a tragic, cheap Halloween costume than a symbol of genuine Western authority. The bright, cinematic fabrics of his youth are replaced by cheap, stiff cotton that constantly chafes fragile, aging skin. Local carnival promoters would hastily string up a cheap, painted canvas banner over a small, dusty performance area. The loudly painted letters proudly proclaimed the old man as the legendary silver screen Western star. It was a deeply tragic, highly ironic title that felt entirely out of place next to the cheap cotton candy stands and the rusted mechanical rides. Teenagers and young children walking past his small enclosure had no idea who this tired old man was. The youth simply saw a desperate elderly citizen wearing a dirty cowboy hat, trying to earn a few pathetic coins. The sheer physical agony required to maintain this specific illusion proved devastating to witness. Throughout the grueling long decades of the 1940s and the 1950s, a human body aggressively broke down. Decades of performing dangerous cinematic horseback stunts had permanently damaged a fragile spine and worn down major joints. The rider was suffering from severe debilitating arthritis that made merely walking across a small room a painful, exhausting ordeal. Yet every single afternoon the veteran was forcefully required to drag aching, fragile bones into a heavy leather saddle. The magnificent, highly trained white stallions of his glamorous Hollywood youth were entirely gone. The legend was now riding cheap rented fairground ponies that looked just as tired and defeated as he did. The physical act of gripping the heavy leather reins sent sharp, blinding pain shooting directly through gnarled, arthritic fingers. When the cheap, distorted fairground music started playing through the tinny speakers, the actor had to force an unnatural, stiff smile onto a deeply wrinkled face. The performer would gently trot the small horse in tight, depressing circles around a muddy makeshift arena, smelling heavily of cheap beer and livestock. The cowboy would perform simple, modified rope tricks that a much younger, physically capable man could easily do in his sleep. every single jolt of the horse violently rattled a fragile, aging spine, sending shockwaves of pure agony through a damaged nervous system. The veteran was willingly subjecting himself to daily physical torture just to entertain a small handful of bored, distracted agricultural workers. When the short, pathetic performance finally concluded, the profound psychological humiliation truly began. The former multimillionaire who used to casually purchase sprawling California estates would slowly walk the dirt fence line. The star was literally reduced to quietly holding out a battered tin cup, begging for loose copper pennies and dirty crumpled dollar bills. The beggar had to look directly into the eyes of pitying strangers and humbly thank them for their meager financial charity. This grueling, physically destructive, deeply embarrassing routine was repeated endlessly across the dusty, forgotten backroads of rural America. This represents the unforgiving dark side of the American capitalist machine. When the industrial entertainment complex permanently decides you are useless, the system systematically grinds your bones into fine dust. There is no dignified, peaceful exit strategy for a man who gambled an entire fortune and lost everything. The victim was forcefully trapped in a vicious, inescapable cycle of physical exhaustion and total financial desperation. The elder was literally working himself directly into an early agonizing grave because stopping meant immediate starvation. The physical survival aspect of this tragedy remains entirely easy for anyone to comprehend. A man must eat, and a man must pay for a cheap roof over his head. But the sheer shocking longevity of this tragic fairground career reveals a much darker, deeply disturbing psychological truth. The veteran continued this brutal, physically agonizing daily routine all the way until the year 1959. The performer was an incredibly frail, exhausted 74-year-old man still desperately putting on a heavy cowboy hat and climbing onto a horse. At that highly advanced senior age, the physical pain was practically unbearable, and the financial rewards were non-existent. The old man was not dragging a broken 74-year-old body into the mud purely for a handful of dirty copper coins. The actor was hopelessly addicted to a specific, toxic psychological drug. The fallen star was aggressively chasing the faint, ghostly echoes of former cinematic glory. Every single time a small, pathetic group of provincial farmers clapped their hands, the idol could briefly, tightly close tired eyes. In that fleeting temporary moment of scattered cheap applause, the legend could successfully hypnotize himself. The veteran could mentally erase the rusted carnival rides, the dirty tin cup, and the crushing poverty surrounding him. For a few precious, fleeting seconds inside a fading, declining mind, the king was instantly transported back to the 1920s. The star was once again the undisputed, invincible ruler of the Universal Pictures Western Division. The pathetic smattering of rural fairground applause magically morphed into the deafening roar of a sold-out cinematic premiere. This fragile, deeply tragic mental illusion served as the only thing keeping a shattered, broken soul tethered to the earth. The outcast was terrified of quietly sitting in a cheap rented room and finally facing the absolute reality of a ruined life. The ego simply could not psychologically process the massive, undeniable fact that the millionaire had lost everything and ended up utterly alone. So the gladiator continued to violently punish a physical body just to secure that brief, intoxicating hit of public validation. The cheap, pathetic fairground applause was the only remaining psychological barrier standing between the old man and total mental collapse. The veteran willingly traded final remaining shreds of basic human dignity for the desperate, pathetic illusion of historical relevance. The idol allowed the cruel, unforgiving world to openly mock an aging, decaying physical form under the harsh glare of cheap spotlights. The survivor endured the deeply pitying, uncomfortable stares of strangers and the agonizing daily physical pain in shattered joints. The outcast did all of this simply because the silence of anonymity was absolutely terrifying. The silence meant the massive, beautiful Hollywood dream was truly, permanently dead and buried. The silence meant the legend was just another failed, bankrupt, forgotten old man waiting quietly for the inevitable, bitter end. The cowboy rode those cheap-tired horses in endless, depressing circles because the constant physical motion prevented the mind from looking back. The veteran could not bear to look back at the tragic, smoking ruins of an incredible life. The legendary millionaire hero spent his final healthy years operating as a deeply tragic living ghost, entirely haunted by the crushing invisible weight of a crown he no longer possessed. Why did Jack Hoxie really lose everything? Usually, when a Hollywood star plummets into bankruptcy, the story follows a highly predictable, tragic path. We expect to find a dark trail of empty liquor bottles, crippling gambling debts, or a devastating public scandal. Jack Hoxie possessed absolutely none of those typical vices. The cowboy did not drink his massive fortune away. The star was not destroyed by reckless personal hedonism. The king was systematically eliminated by a ruthless technological paradigm shift that triggered a fatal, self-destructive psychological trap. To truly understand the depth of his downfall, you have to dissect the intense psychological terror of his hidden reality. He possessed a global empire built entirely on supreme physical mastery. This was a man who could effortlessly break a wild Mustang with his bare hands, survive brutal desert heat, and execute bone-crushing stunts that left audiences screaming. Yet, a simple, lightweight piece of typewritten paper acted as an impenetrable brick wall. Imagine the crushing internal anxiety of that existence. The ultimate, untouchable symbol of rugged American masculinity, earning millions of dollars, secretly terrified of a fountain pen and a script. During the roaring silent era, the Hollywood ecosystem inadvertently protected this vulnerability. The industry valued raw kinetic energy over intellectual refinement. But the synchronized microphone did not just record audio. It violently rewrote the fundamental rules of human value within the studio system. Suddenly, the ability to read complex dialogue and project theatrical emotion became the only currency that mattered. For a functionally illiterate man, the soundstage instantly transformed from a glorious playground into a terrifying, inescapable interrogation room. When the studio system demanded his submission to the new era, it was an existential threat. Staying in Hollywood meant standing under the scorching studio lights, completely stripped of his physical invincibility, struggling to read words he could not comprehend while an entire crew watched. It meant being humiliated by younger, educated stage actors imported directly from New York. For a man whose entire identity was forged in the unforgiving frontier culture, a culture that demands a man never show weakness, this kind of public degradation was a fate significantly worse than financial ruin. He applied romantic, outdated cowboy logic to a cold, calculating corporate problem. The veteran believed he could simply outdraw the future. He chose to fire the massive studio machine before it could fully expose his biggest flaw. The actor walked away to protect his ego, entirely blinding himself to the economic suicide he had just committed. This desperate need for psychological safety explains every single bizarre, disastrous business decision he made after walking out the studio gates. Look meticulously at the specific ventures the entrepreneur aggressively pursued during the Great Depression: a massive traveling circus, an isolated Arizona dude ranch. From a purely economic standpoint, draining a staggering fortune into these operations was absolute madness. But from a psychological perspective, These ventures were brilliant, desperate acts of self-preservation. What exactly is a traveling circus? It is a loud, chaotic, sensory-driven environment based entirely on physical action and raw spectacle. What is a dude ranch? A tightly controlled, isolated environment where paying guests watch him ride horses and tell unscripted campfire stories. What is the one critical element completely missing from both of those businesses? A written script. There were no highly sensitive boom microphones hanging over the circus dirt. There were no demanding directors handing him dialogue revisions inside the ranch lodge. The fallen star was deliberately spending his final millions to artificially reconstruct the exact same safe, script-less environment of the silent film era. The fugitive was literally buying a custom-built reality where his illiteracy would remain permanently hidden. The outcast desperately purchased an illusion where he could still be the undisputed king. But the American capitalist machine does not respect fragile artificial realities. The corporate entertainment industry is a cold, ruthless predator that only cares about relentless adaptation and maximum profit. You absolutely cannot shoot a technological revolution with a prop silver revolver. You cannot outride a shifting cultural paradigm on the back of a white stallion. By refusing to adapt and face his deepest insecurity, he sealed his own terrifying fate. The microphone acted as a brutal, uncompromising industrial filter. It aggressively sifted through the Hollywood ranks, elevating the adaptable, educated performers and mercilessly discarding the authentic, unlettered pioneers who had originally built the industry with their bare hands. Jack Hoxie fell straight through that unforgiving filter. The genuine cowboy survived real outlaws, broken bones, and the untamed wilderness. But the veteran could not survive the sheer humiliation of the written word. The idol chose absolute pride over professional adaptation. That single, fatal choice killed the king of the silent Western and sent the legend directly to a nameless, dusty grave in Oklahoma. Walk down Hollywood Boulevard today. Look closely at the thousands of names permanently embedded in the polished terrazzo and brass stars. Millions of eager tourists walk directly over them every single afternoon. Fans take happy photographs with the names of the powerful people who built the American entertainment empire. But Jack Hoxie is undeniably not buried under the bright lights of Los Angeles. To find the ultimate devastating conclusion of a multi-million-dollar story, you have to leave the California sunshine completely. You have to drive far out into the isolated, dusty plains of Oklahoma. You have to locate the quiet, unremarkable grounds of the Willow Bar Cemetery. There are no flashing cameras gathered here. There are no enthusiastic tour guides pointing out a final resting place to crowds of fans. There is only a simple, lonely stone slab quietly baking under the relentless Midwestern sun. This vast physical distance between Hollywood and Oklahoma perfectly represents the brutal, terrifying trajectory of an entire life. His story serves as the ultimate terrifying autopsy of the American dream. The actor did not inherit a massive trust fund or come from a wealthy, powerful family. The legend started out as a genuine, hard-working cowpuncher struggling in the rugged dirt of Idaho. The worker used raw physical strength and authentic frontier grit to climb the highest, most exclusive mountain in the world. The cowboy became the undisputed, untouchable king of the silent Western movie genre. The idol personally generated millions of dollars in revenue for Universal Pictures. The millionaire bought the sprawling luxury estates. The star purchased the custom-imported cars. The icon held the entire attention of the world in the palm of a calloused hand. But the American capitalist machine acts as a ravenous, emotionless beast. The industry demands constant, highly efficient adaptation from human workers. When the sensitive boom microphone arrived on the studio lot, The device instantly rendered incredible physical skills worthless. The new technology ruthlessly exposed a lack of formal education. The shift stripped the star of corporate value overnight. Instead of quietly accepting a new reality, massive cowboy pride forced the veteran into a deadly financial spiral. The fallen star desperately tried to buy fame back. The gambler drained an entire staggering fortune into a doomed, poorly managed traveling circus. When that massive operation collapsed in spectacular public bankruptcy, nature took whatever small pieces were left. A sudden, violent nighttime fire burned the Arizona Dude Ranch straight down to the ashes. Every single attempt to rebuild a shattered life met with total destruction. The universe systematically stripped away wealth, property, and finally basic human dignity. The millionaire superstar was violently reduced to an exhausted old man riding cheap ponies at dirty rural carnivals. The beggar pleaded for loose change in a tin cup just to survive another miserable week. But the final fatal blow was not financial. The strike proved purely biological. A ruthless, aggressive case of leukemia invaded his bloodstream, systematically destroying the last remaining ounces of physical strength. The pioneer died broke, isolated, and entirely forgotten by the industry he helped build. The outcast possessed only enough loose change to afford the cheapest wooden coffin available on the open market. Standing over the dirt grave in Oklahoma brings this entire tragedy into sharp, painful focus. The epitaph carved directly into the weathered headstone reads, "A star in life, a star in heaven." It serves as a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to hold on to a legacy that the world had already aggressively discarded decades ago. Jack Hoxie lived exactly like the words etched into that lonely tombstone. The icon shone as the brightest, most spectacular star on the silver screen, but the veteran was violently thrown down into the deepest mud of bankruptcy in real life. Hollywood represents a place that can easily turn a poor, illiterate cowboy into a global king. But the industry is also a ruthless machine, perfectly willing to crush that exact same king into fine dust the very second the sound of a new era begins. The applause faded long ago, leaving behind only unpaid debts and shattered lives. What are your thoughts on the harsh lives behind the fame? Leave a comment below. If you liked this video, hit subscribe to join us behind the scenes of hidden legends. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.